We have Dr. Ann Fountain. Anita's with us this week to accompany us on this journey with José Martí. She'll be presenting on Thursday, but we participate the whole time. It's a real pleasure to have Ann Fountain with us. It's her fault that this is happening at all. In 2016, we had a conference here on Marti in Tampa, and Anita came, and after it was over, she called me about a month later and said, "You have to do an NEH Institute about this." And there were times when I hated her from telling me that, but it all worked out. So if it hadn't been for Anita, none of this would have taken place, I assure you. The other thing is I want you to know that I took very seriously, as did Dennis, your comments last week. And so I threw out my presentation. And no, it's good. It's good. And decided to redo it. So the way I view it is, week one we talked so much about Ybor City and the cigar workers and Key West and Tampa and all of that. This week, we're going to discover Marti in a more sort of general fashion. And so I titled this Multiple Martis, because Marti in a real way is a cipher. He's someone that everyone seems to have their own Marti. There's good reasons for this. One is the sheer volume of material he produced. As a working writer, he was writing about everything, and the tone and the focus and of what he's saying changes based on venue, based on the audience, based on what his obsession is at that time. And so right now, for example, in the new obras completas that are being edited, they're up to 27 volumes, and they're projecting 42 volumes at the end. So, and they're still discovering new material on Marti, right? So there's so much there that everybody's able to sort of find their own Marti. Although Marti's entire life was focused on overthrowing Spanish rule, his writing is not systematic or programmatic. And so it's nearly impossible to read Marti as a consistent, or I wouldn't say consistent, but as a programmatic thinker and writer. And so therefore people have their own approaches and are able to tease out philosophies or programs that may or may not be defendable based on the text. And also, just as Rafael Rojas says, Marti invents Cuba out of this very disparate society with very disparate interests. We have to remember, and maybe for some people this is controversial, for me it's not, is that when Marti is not born into Cuba, there is not something universally agreed upon about what it means to be Cuban as Marti is writing. You have annexationists, you have autonomists, you have a whole range of loyalists, you have a whole range of opinions about what it means to be Cuban or if Cuban is even something that exists. And Marti, in a way, through sheer force of rhetoric and oratory and organization, creates this idea of a nation, of a Cuban nation. But as Rojas says correctly, he doesn't invent a state. He invents a nation, a series of concepts in which people can identify, but not a governing structure for that state. But it's also no less true, if Marti invents Cuba, it's also no less true that Marti invents himself. And from the very earliest notebooks, Marti has a lot of phrases where he says the only true subject of poetry is the self. I need to just look in myself and find myself. And there's this sort of obsession of this internal search. And so Marti invents himself. And then, being that he dies at the beginning of the revolution and doesn't live to see Cuba become Cuba, the subsequent generations have to turn around and invent Marti. And create a Marti out of these disparate elements that were available at the time, or more properly, according to the political expediency of the various constituencies that wanted to utilize the image of Marti for their own political purposes. So the point of this presentation is not to present a coherent or a particular image of Marti. Instead, I view this as the introduction for a week-long project that will encourage you to discover your own José Martí, the Martí that you want to eventually find there and put together. So what I plan to do today is the following. As I said, I took seriously your comments last week. So I'm going to present a sort of conceptual framework for understanding Marti, as a complete sort of all his writings, a sort of system to maybe conceptualize the whole of Marti's writing. And then I'm going to go through, I know that some of you are experts in José Martí and know much more than I do about José Martí. Others maybe don't, or interested in other aspects of this history, and don't have an intimate knowledge of Marti's life and works. And still others are probably know aspects of Marti as related to their own disciplinary interests. So, what I'm going to do in the second part is present a brief chronology of Marti, just so that you can have a sort of coherent sense of where he was, what he was doing, and what was going on in his life. And I hope to do all of that by 10:45, so that then we can take a break. And then I'm going to present some quotes, not extensive quotes, and I'm going to give you all a handout with those quotes. And based on your interest, have you all group up a little bit, discuss these quotes, and then open it up for a general discussion to try to address particular issues of Marti. Okay? So I'm going to go rather quickly. I also, all of the quotes, and so, again, this is like an introductory reading. At the end, I'm going to give you a list of readings, some that have already been assigned and a couple that are new. Since I've come to know you and know some of your interests, I added a couple of Marti texts that weren't originally on the list. Everything I quote and everything comes from here, so you all have the copy of the book. I did that on purpose so that we all would have the same material to work with. And then, on Friday morning, there's scheduled discussion on Marti's readings. And so, Ann Fountain and I are going to be here, and what I hope is during the week, based on that list of readings and anything else that you want to explore, I mean, this is a marvelous collection and a marvelous translation, and Marti is so much fun. Really, he's fun to read. At least I find him fun to read. On Friday, that we come and we discuss openly those texts. And so Anita and I and you, we all participate in a general conversation about any aspect of Marti. Okay, so that's how I'm envisioning this week. This is the Marti week. Okay, so who are these multiple Martis? Also talking about Marti as inventing himself. I love that quote from the Notebook. It's called Clouds. And the same, the quote from Adorno, I think, is very prescient. This was a picture I took in Havana. Somebody had taken pieces of a destroyed awning, and taped it all together and created this marvelous Marti, which I really love. So when I teach Marti, You know, I like to approach them in these three categories. You know? These are not mutually exclusive categories. They're ways of looking at it. So one is as a public intellectual. You know? Marti is a chronicler of his time, but he's engaged with the political, philosophical, scientific, and artistic questions and figures of his day. He's in a dialogue with what's going on in the world around him and taking a position. In this sense, he's an extraordinary resource for understanding the historical period he's living in, and from a very unique point of view. You know, as a Latin American exile, living and working in the capital, the world capital of the modern industrial age. Second, as a poet, and I view Marti primarily as a poet, primarily as a writer, as a creator, as an artist, in the widest sense of the word. You know, someone who uses language like an engineer would use steel or concrete. You know, this idea that you can use language to actually create something in the world, to change the world. And third, as a teacher, you know, Marti, in everything he's doing, he's teaching, but he's also a teacher. That's his vocation. He teaches his entire life. He's a teacher in Mexico, he's a teacher in Guatemala, he's a teacher in Venezuela, he's a teacher in the United States. He teaches high school. He teaches adult education classes in the evening in La Liga in New York. He teaches at the university. He teaches in Guatemala. He teaches at the Girls Academy in Guatemala City for free. He's a teacher, and he thinks about teaching, and he has a pedagogical approach that you'll have a chance to look at. You know? And this idea of teaching influences everything that he does. So his chronicles are also designed with a pedagogical purpose, to teach Latin Americans about what's going on in the United States, to teach immigrants, Cuban immigrants to the United States, about their own history and their own sense of identity. So he's a teacher, and teaching is a very key part. Finally, all of these activities find their focus and are channeled, you know, through the political. That is his self-imposed mission to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule. Personally, I'm very interested in this compulsion that's going to become a real compulsion in art and literature in the 20th century, especially in Latin America and other parts of the Third World, to broach the divide between art and reality, you know, to find a way to somehow create art that is politically engaged and that can actually bring about revolutionary change. You know? So, in a way, Marti prefigures, you know, a lot of topics that are going to become so important for those of us who study Latin American literature and art in the 20th century. You know? For example, all his life, in lots of letters and in the notebooks, he talks about this epic that he's writing about the 10 Years' War. This book never appears. Who's ever seen this book? You know, there might be little fragments here or there. It's not meant to be a history of the 10 Years' War. It's meant to be a sort of epic of the 10 Years' War, in the sense of creating a national mythology, you know, or a sense of a national epic, you know, that would provide a sense of identity. And I think, isn't this exactly what Carpentier wanted to do with magic realism or Garcia Marquez and what have you? But he was too busy, he couldn't finish it. There's also in Marti, speaking about this, you know, almost a sense of guilt at being a poet, you know? Almost as though it's almost a waste of time, you know, to be engaged in these esoteric considerations of poetic writing when there's much more urgent things going on. He talks, for example, in a very famous and very important and very telling letter to Gonzalo de Quesada from April 1st, 1895, a letter that's known as his literary testament, where he's telling Gonzalo, this is what you need to do with my writings, you know. And he refers to, for example, his book collection, which is very small, according to him, because for him it's vain to be spending money on the books that he would have liked to have. But he refers to his books as his vices. Those are my vices, you know. Or he says about what he writes about Cuba. He says, the things I've written about Cuba, what have I not written about Cuba? He said, I've written everything about Cuba. None of it is digno. None of it is worthy. Only what I'm going to do now is worthy. You know? You can get rid of all that stuff. Only what I'm going to do is my actions, those that are important. And in fact, you can say, you know, Marti's often referred to as a dreamer, but I think he would have taken great offense at that, no? And I think that it's still an open question, no, of whether he put himself in death's way in Cuba as a way of proving, you know, that he wasn't just a poet, that he was also a warrior. So just to look at each one now, I know this might be very hard to read, so you're going to get all of these in, I'm going to give you a photo, in fact, I'll just give it to you now. All of these are here.
It's in the book.
So you can just, so this is what you'll refer to, yeah, this is what you refer to as. So I didn't cite, this first one about the chronicle of the intellectual, I didn't cite an actual chronicle for this because there's too many and they're all over the place. But I think that this citation from personally my favorite essay by Marti, the prologue that he wrote to Pere Bonalda's poem of Niagara, which is not a very good poem. And it hasn't really gone down in history. What's gone down in history is this prologue. Another thing that he says in his literary testament, he goes, I don't know what to do with all those things I've written. I've written so many prologues, I've lost track. Who knows how many prologues are floating up there. And he also, later in life, but he also tells Gonzalo that this one is one worth saving. Even though, he says, even though it's so violent. It's very violent, but it's worth it. Yeah? But I get it as a sense of this quote, all is expansion, communication, fluorescence, contagion, diffusion. The newspapers deflower grandiose ideas. Ideas do not form families in the mind as before, or build homes, or live long lives. They go at a gallop, mounted on lightning, winged. They, ideas, are wrung out, placed on a pedestal, worn as a crown, stuck on a spike, worshipped as idols, overturned, raised up, and torn down. We arise in the morning with one problem, and by the time we go to bed at night, we have exchanged it for another. Images devour themselves in the mind. You know, this sense of overload. No, content overload. We're living in that now. Could you imagine him in the age of Google? Instagram, yeah. In the structural change we are witnessing, this remaking of the world by men along which the new life gallops like a fiery steed pursued by barking dogs, nature, human labor, and the spirit of man open like pure and inexhaustible springs to the thirsty lips of the poets, who empty out the bitter old wine from their goblets carved of precious stones, and set them down where they will be filled with the sun's rays, the echoes of toil, and good simple pearls drawn up from the depths of the soul. It's almost a political manifesto, no, saying that the new poetry, no, needs to leave behind these old romanticisms, no, these old chalices of precious stones, and find in the factory, in the workshops, in the streets, find the juice, you know, for their poetic construction. The battlefield is in the factories, glory and peace, the temple throughout the earth, the poem in nature. Only what is direct is powerful. And those of us who study Cuban literature know the famous La Sama Lima quote, only the difficult is good. No? And Marti's the other one, only the direct is powerful. I like to juxtapose those two ideas. So, There's no need to go into this aspect of Marti in the historical context in which he finds himself. New York in the Gilded Age, the establishment of the liberal regimes in Latin America that find themselves in this condition of economic dependency, the age of imperialist expansions, the age of nationalist projects. You know, this is the age when Germany's becoming Germany, Italy's becoming Italy, Japan is being transformed. It's in the air, this idea of creating nations. You know? All of these elements are evident, are an evident contradiction. And like other Latin American poets of his time, Rodó, Darío, there's a desire to achieve something that some people have called a counter-modernity, you know, an alternative modernity, or a modernity that embraces the enormous potential for material progress afforded by modern technology, and yet retains a poorly defined autochthonous spirituality that derives from this long Hispanic tradition of honor and chivalry and female virtue. You know, this idea to try to reconcile these two. This is an aspect of Marti that I find surprisingly consistent from his earliest years. This is a fragment from one of his notebooks from 1871. He hasn't yet been to the United States. He won't be in the United States yet for another 10 years. And yet in his notebook he writes this here, which is really interesting. He goes, "We imitate. No, we copy. No, it is good, they tell us. It is American, we say. We believe because we need to believe. Our life does not resemble theirs, and on many points it must not become like theirs. The American laws have given the North a high degree of prosperity and have also raised it to the highest degree of corruption. It has been metallized to make it prosper. Accursed be prosperity at such a cost. I want to educate a country that will save a drowning man and never go to Mass."
What page is that?
This is on page 21 here in this book. Yeah. So that aspect it's also something that's in the air, you know. So in this way, Marti is both modern and anti-modern, revolutionary and conservative. His profession itself, this idea of being a freelance syndicated journalist, is a modern job. And his mobility is also something that's extremely modern, you know? And yet this sense of honor, chivalry, ethical intransigence seem to arise from a much more ancient moral code. This plays out through his entire writing. You know, there's always this tension in Marti between the cosmopolitan city and the pure rural world, you know? Nature versus the city. Many of you, I'm sure, teach Our America, no, Nuestra America, and there's always a dichotomy, you know, between the natural man and the imported book. What is that natural man? What is that imported book? And that's something that plays out, again, that he's thinking about his entire life. Another extraordinary circumstance of Marti's chronicles is that due to his location and the nature of his journalism, he becomes the interpreter of North America for Latin American nations, which affords him enormous power, almost like an aggregator. No, he's like the Huffington Post of the time, where he's selecting those aspects of the U.S. he believes that are most useful for those young nations that view the U.S. with a mixture of awe and trepidation. You know? Susanna Rothber's book, which many of you know, shows it's extraordinary how Marti composes. We would fail our students for committing plagiarism if they wrote like Marti wrote. But this idea of having all the newspapers open before him and selecting, and he's interpreting and translating and improvising on his own while he's writing. You know? So he's writing and reading at the same time and translating America for Latin America. Really interesting. You know? Ivan Schulman, he describes the Chronicles of Marti in terms of a double discourse, what he calls an informative discourse and a discourse of desire. The first embodying Marti's desire to present an objective representation of what he sees and experiences. That is, a style that reflects the world he's observing. You know? And that means a style of wild juxtaposition, poetic fury next to cold precision, next to tender reflections. You know, these things that like he describes in the prologue. Almost a cinematographic, you know, sense of sequencing. The second, the discourse of desire, is this lens where he tries to find the universal in the particular and to try and reconcile, whenever possible, the extremes. What you never find in Marti, or rarely find in Marti, is accusations, direct criticism. He's always trying to find the sort of positive angle, you know, of what he sees. A good one, a good chronicle to read in that regard is Coney Island. You know, Coney Island's a good one to read in that regard. And how he talks about how Americans can't enjoy themselves even when they're enjoying themselves. You know? Everything is work. And so enjoyment is also work, you know? Okay. Regarding the aesthetic, you know, one of the most common words that you'll find in Marti throughout his writing is the word útil, the word usefulness. Marti wants to be useful, even in his art and his poetry. You know? And yet, above all, he's a writer, he's a poet. And so how can that be useful? You know? For him, that means that we need an art that reflects the times he lives in and that moves people to action. It means in Marti a rejection, even though it's a rejection of the novel as a sort of fatuous entertainment, even though he does write one, or maybe more than one. I know that Anita knows a lot about that. There's also a suspicious attitude towards poetry. Even when he writes these revolutionary poetry, there's a suspicion. He says in his prologue, he says, these are times for prose, not poetry. But he writes poetry his whole life, right? There's this idea of a writing of energy and a direct experience over form and control. He's also very much in tune with the symbolists in the sense of believing that there's a correspondence. It's almost a sort of mystical correspondence between language and the cosmos. And that by the proper ordering of language, the proper construction of language, you find a mirror, you know, of a sort of cosmic harmony. You know? And I think I include a quote here that relates to that, you know? Yeah, the Emerson, you know? There are no contradictions in nature, but only in the men who are unable to discern its analogies. You know, and the way that you discern the analogies of nature is through language, you know, through language and through representation. In a way, you know, Marti, who wasn't religious, he was a Mason. There is this idea, and this is not only Marti, but of the modernists in general, know that after the collapse of religion, there has to be a new religion, and that new religion is art. You know, human beings. He says it in one of his notebooks too. You know, art is man's nature. You know, that we create our own nature in which we live. Teacher. You know, the pedagogical. As I said before, teaching is so integral to his life that it's impossible to separate it from his other activities. There's a pedagogical function to almost everything he writes. As a chronicler, he educates the newspaper reading public in Latin America about the United States and about itself. He works as a high school and university teacher in Mexico, Guatemala, Cuba, New York, and all the way to the end. He teaches ESL and citizenship classes to working class and black Cubans and Puerto Ricans in La Liga in New York. He's involved in the founding of La Liga with Rafael. He teaches every Thursday night. That was his night. Every Thursday night he taught at La Liga. And he single-handedly writes, edits, and publishes this beautiful magazine. Here's a facsimile reproduction of it. La Edad de Oro, the Golden Age, you know, which was financed by a wealthy Brazilian. Wasn't he Brazilian? Yeah, a wealthy Brazilian who wanted to create a Spanish language educational children's magazine. And Marti writes it almost completely by himself. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And I gave you all the photocopy of the introduction in the first issue, which is very interesting. Not only for his pedagogical approach, but also his approach to the difference between boys and girls. And it's kind of interesting. And the reason it stops being published is because he has a falling out with the financier, because the financier wants him to write about religion. He's like, where's the religion? Here, kids need religion, they need to know about religion. And Marti was not interested in teaching religion. So there's a thing. I like the line that we will talk to them about everything that is done in workshops where even more strange and interesting things happen than in magic stories and are real life magic, which is better than the other kind of magic. This is an article too that I added to the list of readings. Really interesting article he wrote about rural schools and about this project to send out teachers into the countryside to teach rural communities. And he has a very interesting approach, you know, about they don't need book learning in the same way that we do. That book learning is kind of useless. They need to learn about the world around them, but they also need someone to go and to converse with them and to learn about them. There's this whole interest. I related to this idea of the natural man too. You know, Marti's interest in understanding common folk. You know? Finally, political and revolutionary. You know, this to me is both the most obvious and the most opaque of Marti's facets. The dream of Cuban independence is born in Marti from the beginning, perhaps because of the influence of his teacher and mentor, Rafael Mendive, Maria de Mendive, who he eventually goes to live with, who pays for his studies, and who is an independence activist, is also arrested, is also exiled from Cuba, goes to Spain, escapes to France, from France goes to New York, makes his way back, in the same trajectory that Marti will make. But also, there's also, I think, an issue there of rebelliousness against his father. Remember, he's 15 years old. A 15-year-old, 16-year-old might be interested in Cuban independence, you know, but there's got to be other motivations there as well. And I think both of these play a role in his early sense. However, this, regardless of what his inspiration for becoming so interested in Cuban independence, it's certainly after his experience as a political prisoner sent to the quarries of San Lázaro that would leave psychological and physical scars that plagued him his entire life, where this project for Cuban independence ceases to be merely an intellectual exercise, merely a spiritual exercise. He carries it around in his body, you know, and in his mind. How traumatic that experience must have been, and he writes about it in a very powerful way in Exile Político in Cuba. So what begins perhaps as a romantic notion of natural liberation, for example, I think of Abdallah, which he wrote while he was living with Rafael Mendive, you know, comes face to face with the physical, embodied reality of oppression. You know? And when he gets to Spain, he writes Presidio Político in Cuba, and there's the famous two examples there that he uses, which, again, makes me wonder about the poetic aspect of his rhetoric. What do I mean by this? The two examples he provides to illustrate the cruelty of the Spaniards is the story of Lino, the 12-year-old boy who is abused and gets sick and I believe dies in the prison. Is the one example, the little boy up in the Spanish prison. And the other one is a black man that he claims is over 100 years old. I don't know about that. Juan de Dios, no, who's simple-minded. And the idea, how can the Spanish do this? What can a 100-year-old simple-minded black man do? Those seem to me, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, it wasn't true. I'm just saying it seems to me like two strategically chosen examples that Marti is using there. He knows, he's aware of what he's doing rhetorically already. So this notion of this original notion of natural liberation expands after his experiences in Mexico, Guatemala, and Venezuela. And there, in those places, he experiences firsthand the incomplete liberation project of Bolívar and San Martín, the danger of caudillismo, the closed-mindedness and petty authoritarianism of the new republics. And again, I think of our America. And people think of our America, often they think of it and present it in classes as sort of opposition, you know, the United States versus Latin America. I view it differently. I view it as an indictment of Latin America, a vicious criticism of Latin American politics, you know. I think of the same thing when it comes to when people teach 100 Years of Solitude. They say, oh, that's the Bible, and 100 years, oh. 100 Years of Solitude is a very vicious criticism of Latin America, too, and its closed-mindedness. And so Cuban independence becomes a vehicle for rectifying the incomplete project of independence initiated by the Libertadores. In other words, Cuban liberation acquires continental dimensions. You know? Then after living in the U.S., this project expands even further. And the rather simple dichotomy of a materialistic Anglo culture versus a more spiritual and honor-driven Latin culture, which appears in the notebooks, as I mentioned before, and which appear also deliciously in his first English-language U.S. chronicle from 1880 in The Sun, the Impressions of America by a Very Fresh Spaniard. You know? And there's a lot of this sort of like criticism of the materialism. I remember this one image where he describes a young girl going to school, and she has lots of rings and necklaces and all of this, and he says, what kind of a culture sends a young girl to school dressed in this way? If she's so fond of jewelry at such a young age, what is she going to do for it when she's an adult? Again, I'm just saying this is the judgment is you. But anyway, his experience living in the United States for 15 years adds a level of nuance and profundity that far surpasses that of other Latin American writers' assessment of reality of the U.S. You compare Marti's assessment of the United States to Sarmiento's, for example. Nothing. Now I get it. So he becomes essentially a continental advocate for Latin American independence, also serving as counsel and representative for Argentina, for Uruguay. He represents Uruguay in Washington, D.C. He meets major figures in U.S. government. So Marti is not just this solitary figure working in New York City. He has continental reach. People know who he is everywhere, and he's an important figure. This subtlety, this knowledge of the United States, I just want to read a small quote from an article he wrote in English. Oh no, this one wasn't written in English, but The Truth About the United States. It's such a great piece, no? He says, this was page 329, just read a couple of quotes. He says, there are no races. There is nothing more than mankind's various modifications of habit and form in response to the conditions of climate and history in which he lives, which do not affect that which is identical and essential. He says, where's this slide? I love this slide. The only way to find out, and this is so different, right? The first things that he wrote where he's saying there's a difference between the Anglos and the Latins. Here he seems to be saying exactly the opposite. He says, the only way to find out whether Saxons and Latins are different, or to compare them, is by seeing how they have reacted under comparable conditions. And it is a fact that in the southern states of the American Union, where there were black slaves, the predominant character of the people is as haughty, as idle, as tempestuous, and as helpless as the character of the sons of Cuba may be as a result of slavery. It is a mark of supine ignorance and childish, punishable light-mindedness to speak of the United States and of the real or apparent achievements of one of its regions or a group of them as a total and equal nation of unanimous liberty and definitive achievements. Such a United States is an illusion or a fraud. There is a whole world between the north of Schenectady, with its brick houses and lordly freedom, and the south of St. Petersburg, between the clean, self-interested town of the north and the loafers sitting on cracker barrels at the country store in the angry, impoverished, ramshackle, bitter, gray towns of the South. So this is no longer merely a romantic notion of nation building, but rather a highly informed historical assessment of the reality of the Cuban situation and the U.S. situation, and an attempt through sheer rhetorical force to overcome the fragmented, unequal, racially segregated, dependent nature of Latin American societies through the propagation of a new ideology of social justice and equality based on what he calls the Montecristi Manifesto, quote unquote, the radical dignity of man. Love that. A nation founded on the idea of the radical dignity of humankind. Much is made, and rightly, of Bolivar and San Martin's exploits on horseback, the titanic labor of traversing mountains and jungles and deserts to unite the disparate peoples of South America. We're all familiar with the Jamaica letter, where Bolivar writes, "Somos un pequeño género aparte." No, we're a little human race, a little separate human race. And Bolivar's final despair, no? He who serves the revolution plows the sea. No, that famous idea. Marti echoes this epic. Marti travels, if you all see Al Lopez's biography of Marti, he compiles a chart with all the kilometers traveled by Marti. That travels through all the nations of South America. I bet if you compared the amount of kilometers traversed by Marti and you compare it to Bolivar and San Martin, it's up there. I don't know, they got to be closer. Maybe Marti even beats him. Marti wasn't strong and didn't have an army behind him. He was by himself in trains and steamboats and canoes. He travels from Mexico City to Guatemala with his wife, poor guy, overland. In canoes and barges, sleeping in hammocks, hung up between trees in the middle of the jungles of Chiapas, you know? Crazy sort of traveling, you know? So I think that, you know, that's an aspect of Marti that isn't often considered, you know? That the physical traversing of the Caribbean basin and of the United States, you know, to bring these people together. So it's not, I don't think it's a hyperbole to grant Marti the same sort of epic nature, you know, in his story. And so it shouldn't surprise us that at the end, near the end of his life, as he's holed up in Cabo Haitiano in Haiti, waiting to see how the hell he's going to get to Cuba, and there's a false name, and he's hiding there, and he writes the manifesto, you know, that it acquires messianic qualities. You know, that no longer is it Cuban independence, no longer is a continental project. It's a worldwide liberation project that he's imagining at this point. You know? Political independence would have no right to ask Cubans for their help if it did not bring with it the hope of creating one patria for freedom of thought, equality of treatment, and peaceful labor. The War of Independence in Cuba, the island that binds the sheaf of islands, the place that binds, the what?
The knot.
The knot, that's what it was. The knot that binds the sheaf of islands where shortly the commerce of the continents must pass through is a far-reaching human event and a timely service that the judicious heroism of the Antilles lends to the stability and just interaction of the American nations and to the still unsteady equilibrium of the world. You know, Cubans do have a hyperbolic yeah. When a warrior falls on Cuban soil, he falls for the greater good of mankind, for the confirmation of a moral republicanism. Another great line, like the radical dignity of man, moral republicanism in America, for the creation of a free archipelago through which the respectful nations of the world will pour a wealth that must, at its passage, spill over into the crossroads of the world. Of course, you know, the big geopolitical theme at the time is the canal, right? Mm-hmm. Where's the canal going to be? Is it going to be in Nicaragua? Is it going to be in Panama? What have you? So it's this monster project, you know. So what am I doing? Okay, you're good? All right. So now I'd like to just go through the chronology, just so for those of you, for some of you this might be repetitious. For others, there might be some insight into this. So I just want to go through these quotes. Through these, through the chronology a little bit. So he's born in Havana from age 4 to 6. They go back to Valencia and live there. The father has a reputation of being this very violent man, have a very bad temper. He gets in trouble a lot. He works his way up professionally, and then he does something where he loses his job. The same thing happens in Spain. He loses his job in Cuba, they go to Spain, he's working in Spain, and then he has some problems at work in Spain. He loses his job in Spain and has to bring the family back to Cuba. 1862. Now, another aspect about Marti that I think is really worth looking at more in depth is his relationship to his parents. The traditional approach to Marti tends to view him as his father as a sort of violent Spaniard, very dictatorial, and Marti rebelling against that, and his mother trying to be protective of him, and always trying to get these crazy notions of revolution out of his head, and have him come back to Cuba, and help, and come on, you have a wife, you have a kid, you need to do that, can't you do that here, this sort of thing. So there's this idea, but he's very close to his father. He travels with his father to a job that he has near Matanzas. He accompanies his father to Belize. He works as his father's secretary. When Marti's living in New York, his father moves to New York and spends a whole year living with Marti and Carmen and Pepito. There's a story that Cubans have to live with. One Cuban comes to the United States and then everybody starts coming and staying with him. And he's got the house full of people. So I think he was very close to his father. They had their problems, they had their tensions, but there's something there, and he learns things from his father. Anyway. And there he does the famous event that he writes about. Says he who witnesses a slave being whipped carries the shame with him for his whole life, and is indebted to that slave. How could you witness that and not feel a moral debt to that person? He's a poet. He's a sensitive soul, even as a young boy. Then he becomes a student at the Escuela de Instrucción Primaria, whose director is Rafael María de Mendive. There's also tension. Mendive eventually, when he realizes that he has a very special student on his hands, gets Marti's father's permission, which I don't think was easy to get. I think there was a matter there of pride. But he pays for Marti's education, and eventually Marti moves in with the Mendive family. And Mendive becomes sort of like a surrogate father for him, or rather the father that understands him. Not that he rejects his own father, but he doesn't think that his father understands him. Mendive understands him. In 69, he publishes Abdala. There's a famous story where the voluntarios in Spain attack an audience at the Teatro Villanueva because there's shouts of Viva Cuba Libre in the theater. They attack them. It's violent. There's gunshots. Leonor, a woman, nonetheless, at that time, in the middle of the night, hears about this, knows that Marti's at the theater, gets in a carriage, finds somebody to drive her to the theater, and pulls her son out of there, saves him from this event, which is pretty extraordinary. She's not able to save him, however, from being arrested in 1869. I'm sure most of you know the story, that there's a letter that's found that is encouraging a Spanish loyalist who went to school with them, that he should be in favor of the Cuban movement. There's some stories about this that are not historically accurate. I think Al Lopez does a good job showing that the traditional story is that Marti has his La Historia de Absolverá moment. At his trial, He stands, but you know, it's because Cuba's a repetition of patterns over and over and over and over again, right? So he stands up in the trial now, says, no, it wasn't Gonzalo de Quesada, it was me, I take responsibility for it, and so Gonzalo gets off lightly, and Marti gets the condemnation. That could not have happened. It just could not have happened. A 16-year-old boy was not the way Spanish courts were set up at that time. Was not. And the only copy of the letter that's signed by both Marti and Quesada, he's the one who produced the letter afterwards. And it would appear that maybe he added his signature in it later, and like, it became part of the story. I'm not saying, but it's not. And the thing is that there's some questioning about it. He's arrested. And after 4 months in prison, he's condemned to 6 years hard labor in the quarries. Famous picture. No, taken of him in court. So he's found guilty, sentenced 6 years, sentenced to hard labor in the limestone quarries at San Jose, chain at the ankle and the wrist. There's the famous story how he had a ring made that says Cuba on it. There's a letter to a friend of his that indicates that his mother's the one who brought the ring up to him. But it wasn't, and maybe this was I always understood the story to be that his mother had it made with Cuba and then takes it to him as a present. But there's a letter from him in New York where he's telling a friend, he goes, hey, where's that ring that I wanted made? And so it could have might have been his idea, his mother's the one who delivered it to him. I'm so sure. Which also talks about this idea of Marti also inventing himself, inventing his own edition. There might be a couple of mistakes here, there might be a couple of things, so, you know, feel free to let me know. So his father is able to help secure his internal exile to the Isle of Pines, where he stays with a family friend. So he does spend that summer, imagine the summer in Cuba, working in the mines. He never recovers fully from this event. He suffers from they think it's sarcoidosis. No, constant inflammation. He has a herniated testicle from the thing. He has to go through various operations. He has a low-grade fever almost his entire life. You know, he's always at fever. He's always having to convalesce. He never recovers physically, and so I think that's also an important aspect of all of this. You know, is Marti's carrying around physically, you know, the decisions he made, and yet he writes extraordinarily valiant, brave letters, you know, from prison to his mother, saying, "This is a learning experience. This is a school for me." You know, I don't think I could do that. Can you do that? Funny, so he's able to secure exile to Spain, and on the boat over to Spain, just been released from prison, he still can't keep his mouth shut. And he denounces the abuses in prison with one of the prison guards. One of the directors in the prison is on the boat with him, and he publicly denounces the abuses in the Spanish prison with this guy on the boat. I mean, lo tenía bien puesto. So immediately, I don't know if people have done a lot of study of this, but Marti was a Mason, and he participated in Masonic lodges wherever he was, and from very early, from 1871, he's already listed in that particular logia as one of the higher degrees of the Masons. So he's not he begins studying law, and he spends 3 years in Spain. He has a number of adventures. He has his wild university years in Spain, his love affairs, his political activities. And he graduates with degrees in civil and canonical law, philosophy, and humanities. His thesis is titled Political Oratory in Rome. Cicero is its greatest exponent. His speech is analyzed in relation to his works on rhetoric. This idea, again, this knowledge of the power of rhetoric, the power of oratory is very young. And when he dies in those Rios, what book does he have in his pocket? The collected speeches of Cicero. I mean, this is an important element to who Marti was. His family has had to emigrate for economic reasons to Mexico City. And so he leaves Spain, travels via Paris, Liverpool, and New York. He's only in New York for a very short time. It's not a definitive visit. And arrives in Mexico, where he meets the neighbor of the family, one of the family's neighbors, who's Manuel Mercado, who's going to become one of his dearest friends for his entire life, and also becomes Secretary of State in Mexico under the liberal government of Lerdo. Mercado plays a very important role. Of course, his famous last letter is to Manuel Mercado, where the famous line of, I've lived in the monster, and I know his entrails, and my sling is the sling of David, and all that. A letter that some people refer to as his political testament. The letter to Gonzalo de Quesada as his literary testament. The letter to Mercado as his political testament. One of the great, I mean, Marti's life sometimes is almost like a novel that was written, That letter, that final letter to Mercado is incomplete, right? He didn't get to finish the letter. And its last fragment, the last fragment of center, there are affections of such delicate honesty. Just a beautiful line, That's the last thing I said, Those are my last words. Affections of delicate honesty. So he begins immediately collaborating with Mercado in his magazine, La Revista Universal. He writes a play, Amor con Amor se paga, which becomes a critical and popular success. He has a famous love affair with a Mexican actress. Unfortunately, one of the original participants, couldn't come because he had an accident that broke his leg, but Gregorio Barrios, who's in San Antonio, is doing a translation, a modern translation of Amor con Amor se paga, sort of recovering this play in English. And there he meets Carmen Sayas Bazán. He lasts there a little over a year before the government of Lerdo falls before Porfirio Díaz, in the beginning of the Porfiriato, where the Revista Universal is shut down. And Marti returns to Havana under his middle name and second last name, Julián Pérez. And Cuba, again, the hostile conditions are untenable, and so he's offered a promise of a job in Guatemala. He actually returns to Mexico for a moment, and then from Mexico he travels to Guatemala. Guatemala at this time, you can imagine what it meant physically to travel from the Atlantic coast or the Caribbean coast of Guatemala up to the capital. It's quite an adventure. And in one of his notebooks, he has this a little thing that he had this idea for a book that was going to be Los Momentos Cumbres de mi vida, the high points of my life. And one of those high points of his life is the hilltop in Guatemala. That's all he writes. The hilltop in Guatemala. It's an experience. April 1877, he's named professor of French, German, Italian, and English literature at the University of Guatemala. He meets the president dictator Barrios and teaches free classes to girls at the Academy of Central America. People in Guatemala give him the nickname Doctor Torrente because of his powers of speech, because he doesn't stop talking. He's a bit of a sabelotodo. He's got an opinion about everything. And they give him this name, the Dr. Torrent, the torrent of words coming out of his mouth. He returns to Mexico to marry Carmen, and takes her back with him overland to Guatemala. Poor girl, from a wealthy family, and here she is with this guy who's muerto de hambre, traveling through an area which is still enormously difficult to travel through at that time. Imagine the mosquitoes, can't imagine. I wouldn't. And then returning to Guatemala in February, the Pacto Sajón, the 10 years war comes to an end. And Marti, who's always getting in trouble, loses his university appointment in Guatemala for political reasons. The conservative politicians in Guatemala do not appreciate his ideas about what Guatemala should be. He's charged, I forget now who asked him to do it, to write a book about Guatemala, and that book is eventually published in Mexico. So
Exactly, don't imagine the book.
yeah, and what gets him in trouble, and he's told, you should leave. He considers going to Peru. And our history would be a lot different probably if he had gone to Peru. But it's his wife and his mother and his family who insist that no, he should come back to Cuba. So he goes back to Cuba in August. He works as a law clerk, and then they take away his law license. And he works as a high school teacher as well in Cuba, and then they take away his teaching credential. Because again, as soon as he gets to Cuba, he immediately starts associating with revolutionary clubs and agitating for independence. He can't help himself. Pepito's born. I love this picture. It's the only picture that we have of Marti cracking a smile. There's no other picture. He's always so serious, no? So there he looks happy there. And that's also another one of the high points of his life. He says when they presented his son to him.
Remember, portraiture in that era required that you have a stern face.
It did?
Yes.
It wasn't
Official portraiture.
Really?
It took so long to expose the
Yeah.
That was hard to keep a
smile for 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, you weren't allowed, I mean, that wasn't, it's not like, they didn't do cheese back then.
Okay, all right, yeah, that's good enough. I didn't know.
Whole families.
Well, he pulled it off on this one. I think it's a charming smile. He pulled it
Yeah,
off.
but that was obviously couldn't resist it.
Right. So in September of '79, he's arrested. It's kind of inevitable, it's going to happen. And he receives 300 visitors at the prison in 1 week. So, and he's only been in Cuba a few months. And Spain, he's deported again to Spain. And he stays a short time in Spain, makes his way back to New York. And he arrives in New York and immediately moves in to the boarding house of Miguel and Carmen Montilla. Immediately, keep in mind, he arrives in New York, I believe the date is January the 5th. By January 24th, he's already named the interim president of the Cuban Revolutionary Committee after giving a really well-regarded speech. You know? The guy could clearly give a speech.
Yeah.
And in March, his wife and son arrive in New York. July 8th, he writes Impressions of America by a very fresh Spaniard in English for Charles Danis, the son, and his work as a chronicler begins. March and April, and October 21st, his wife goes back to Cuba. Enough is enough of this. And November 28th is when Maria Montilla is born, Carmen's daughter. And a lot of people say it's his daughter. So something might have been. I know that Leone does not believe that Maria Montilla es intachable, moralmente intachable. Anyway. He doesn't stay in New York a year. He stays in there a year. And then he goes to Venezuela, where he collaborates with the paper La Opinión Nacional, and he founds a new magazine, La Revista Venezolana, which a more radical vision of modernity begins to take shape. This is after he's already had his experience in New York. He's already had his experience in Mexico and in Guatemala, and his view of what is needed in the Americas begins to expand. He begins to write articles critical of caudillismo and whatnot, and of course, that gets him in trouble. So 6 months he lasts in Guatemala before he is asked kindly to leave. And he returns to New York, and that's where he stays, and that's where he's going to have that long period, his 14 years in New York. August of that year, he returns to New York. Why do I put my afternoon with Emerson here? You're going to hear a lot about Emerson on Thursday when Dr. Fountain talks. That was another one of the highlights of his life. I mean, there's only like about maybe 8 things listed about the high points of my life. He talks the hilltop in Guatemala, when my son Pepito was presented to me, my afternoon with Emerson. It's not him, it's with Emerson's book, Nature. When he read Emerson's book, Nature, it transformed him. you know. Marti wasn't religious, but if there were a religion founded on Ralph Waldo Emerson and nature, he would be a priest of that religion, you know. And in December, Ismaelillo is published. I also put this because there's this picture of Marti with his son, and here's Emerson with his grandson. And I like to think that maybe Marti saw this picture and decided to do the same. You want to do a picture of it? No? You don't like that? So Ismaelillo, which many people consider the sort of first modernista collection of poetry. So 82 to 89 is when he's living in the boarding house run by the Martilla family. He enters his most prolific period of writing, working as a journalist, translator, teacher, counsel, all of these things. December of 82, Carmen Pepito arrived in New York again, and his father arrives 6 months later, and his father stays there a year with them. So he's got his family together. But that must have been a tense family. When his mother's in New York, he writes about how happy he is. And he even writes in a letter, and he says, you know, the noticeable improvement in my health that everyone comments on, it's because my mother's here with me. I don't think there's any corresponding opinion like that in his correspondence when his wife and his father are with him. No? It's a little much more tense. 84, he has the infamous meeting with Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo, where there's the split, right? They're organizing the Guerra Chiquita in Spain, and Marti is not in agreement with their project. And he writes his famous letter to Gómez, which, you know, no se gobierna un país como se manda en un campamento de guerra. In a later letter, very interesting, and this is the one that, that's the meeting that Lisandro Perez talked a lot about, right, in the Hotel of the Madame Grifou. 85, March, so Carmen Pepito returned to Havana, and in a later letter to Manuel Mercado, he implies that they wanted him to go back. His mother wanted him to go back to Havana with them. And he says, I prefer to die here in silence, talking that he refuses to go back to Havana, even though perhaps he could work again and live with his family, but he wouldn't be able to agitate politically, he wouldn't be able to engage in political activity. So he says, I prefer to die here in silence. Maybe there was also other reasons that he preferred to stay in New York too. Could be personal reasons, right? It also could be that New York he liked it. He lived in New York, he was in New York, and he was succeeding in New York. He was an immigrant who he was writing for all these newspapers throughout Latin America. He was translating novels. He was teaching in class. He felt, and again that word that is so common in Marti, útil, useful. He was useful in New York. I think he felt, yeah, I could go. In the same letter he talks about, yeah, I can go there and make a few pesos. But that's not why I'm for.
New York is the only place that never exiled him, right?
That's right. He's not exiled from the United States.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. 87, 88, his mother stays with him for a couple of months. And already, he doesn't come to Key West, or he didn't come to Tampa until November 92. But already, in 88, he's, in 89? No, yeah, 88. He begins writing letters to Dolores Pollo in Key West. And he already wants to go down there and sort of see what's going on. But he doesn't get the invitation for 2 years, and we talked a little bit about that, you know, that he still wasn't the guy, you know. He publishes a vindication of Cuba in the Evening Post. This is a fantastic article where he responds in English to an article that's critical of Cuba that appeared about how Cubans were not capable of self-government. There's a lot of racial overtones in the criticism of Cuba. And he writes a wonderful defense of Cuba in which he uses as an example of Cubans' ability to self-govern what the immigrant communities in Key West have achieved. Just look what they've done in Key West. They educate themselves. He talks about the lectors in the factories in Key West. It's really interesting. It's on the list. He helps establish La Liga and publishes the first issue of La Grande Oro. Starting around 1890, while serving as a consul for these countries in New York, he enters a more overtly political phase of his career. And Cuba and the United States appears. In August, he writes the Versos Sencillos in the Catskills, while visiting some friends of his that were on vacation. In the prologue to Versos Sencillos, he talks about it as though he had to go to the Catskills to convalesce because he was so emotionally distraught after what had happened at the Pan American Conference in Washington, D.C., that the United States was trying to create a single, was trying to tie the currencies of Latin America to the U.S. currency to try to create a political union among the Americas, and he viewed that as an attempt by the United States to create a relationship of pure dependence of Latin America and the United States. And many Latin American governments were sympathetic to this idea, tying their currencies to the U.S. And Marti was vehemently opposed to this, and he talks about this, that strong nations cannot form alliances with close ties like that with weak nations. But he was also happened to be on vacation. In January of 1891, Nuestra America appears, the famous Nuestra America appears. He represents Uruguay in February at the International Monetary Conference in Washington, D.C. Yes?
So the reading, it says Nuestra America was actually composed when he was living in Mexico City.
In the United States, yes.
No, in Mexico. It says it was composed when he was in Mexico.
It was published in Mexico, but it was composed in
New York.
In New York, yes. It was written in New York and published in the Partido Liberal de Mexico City. So in February, he represents Uruguay in the International Monetary Conference. I mean, this is where he meets Blaine. This is where he's a representative, a Latin American representative, and involved in these international debates. And finally, on November 16th, Nestor Cabonet, president of the Ignacio Agramonte Club in Ybor City, invites him, and all of this story of Tampa, which we know so well already, overknown, has begun. So just very quickly, 1891, just to give you an idea of the rapidity of what's going on. November 26th, Tampa Revolution. Yeah, there's us. I do need to crop the side.
Oh, we need to get a sign. Photoshop.
Yeah, okay.
Photoshop. Just don't crop it, Photoshop it. Put something else like NEH Institute.
Yeah, we do. We change it. I agree. So, November 26th, the Tampa resolutions are approved. That same night, he gives the With All and for the Good of All speech. The New Pines the next night. Both of these speeches are transcribed and published and distributed to Cuban communities. Marti becomes nominally the leader of this movement. Christmas Day, he does not go to Key West on that first visit. He wants to, but it's not ready yet. So he goes back to New York, and then finally Pollo is able to convince the other members of the revolutionary clubs in Key West that this guy's for real, that he's not, as his other nickname was here in Tampa, El Pico de Oro, the golden beak, that he was a real revolutionary. And so he goes to Key West, he wins over everybody in Key West, and in January 3rd, 1892, the basis of the Cuban Revolutionary Party and the secret statutes are approved, and now he's off and running, right? So this is the years between 1892 and 1895 are the years of this sort of feverish, non-stop movement and activity. He founds Patria in March of that year. In April, he's elected the delegado of the Revolutionary Cuban Party, and he begins to disavail himself of his other obligations. So during this period, he resigns as counsel, the chronicles, and begins to write primarily for Patria, and he lives as his job, his primary job is the delegado of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. So during this period, it's a period of feverish traveling. He travels to Mexico, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica twice, Haiti twice, Panama, Atlanta, New Orleans, all over the state of Florida, including the 20 documented visits to Tampa that you're going to hear all about tonight, and the eastern seaboard of the United States. And that's where I say that, it's comparable in kilometers to what Bolivar did, to what San Martin did, trying to hold together all of these people. We also talked about before, so I won't go into too much now, but how the experience of the cigar factories here give a certitude and form to what Marti's revolutionary project is. And so these are a lot of the essays at this time are the essays about unity, my race. There are no races. We're all in this together, and he succeeds to finance the revolutionary movement. December 92, he survives the assassination attempt here in Tampa. 1894, he publishes another great piece, to Cuba, in response to the labor strike in Key West and the need for Cuban homeland as the only means of achieving social justice. This is one that's also on the list. There's a big strike in Key West that the Key West cigar factory owners try to break the strike by importing Spanish workers from Havana. And there's violence when these Spanish workers arrive in Key West. The cigar workers who are there attack these strike breakers. Many of these strike breakers don't really know what's going on. They've just been promised to come and have a job. And so there's this violent act. And Marti uses this as a pretext to argue that the only way that the Cubans in Florida are going to get the justice that they crave is if they create it for themselves in their own homeland. And he says, even though his sympathies are with the strikers, he says, we have no right to stop a Spaniard from entering the United States for work. No, this isn't, in a sense, this isn't our country. No, what we've done here should prove to ourselves that we can govern ourselves. And so if we don't want these kinds of incidents happening, we need to go and create that ideal homeland in Cuba. So he uses it as a pretext to encourage and inspire these immigrants to support the war. Remember, a lot of these cigar factory workers in Key West and Tampa were more concerned with labor issues in the United States than they were with Cuban independence. It's Marti that's able to focus their energy towards Cuban independence. But that's also why, as soon as Cuban independence is nominally achieved after the war, these cigar workers go back to worrying about labor conditions here in the United States, much more than they worry about what's going on in Cuba. So that took effort of Marti to hold this coalition together. And finally, the story everybody knows, the end of Marti's 1895. So much happens. Gabriel Cartaya, who's going to talk tomorrow, just published a beautiful little book called Domingos de Tanta Luz, Sundays of So Much Light, and it just follows. It imagines the last Sundays of Marti's life, the 20 Sundays that he had in 1895, and where he was and what was going on. And there's some fictional sort of reflection about what was going on in Marti's head. It's a really beautiful little book, and it'll be on sale tomorrow here. Celebrates his 42nd birthday in New York. Delmanicos, I learned, thanks to Lisandro. February 7th, he makes it to the Dominican Republic, gets together with Maximo Gomez. The war begins in Cuba February 21st. 24th, March 25th, while waiting in Haiti for transport to Cuba, he writes the Montecristo Manifesto, which is the most complete vision of the political and social philosophy of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. He also writes a string of farewell letters that are amazing, beautiful letters to his mother, to his son, and to Carmen and Maria Mantilla. I just want to briefly talk about his son, whether Maria was his daughter or not. This is the last letter he writes to his son. I'm going to find it right now. Or maybe it's not here, this one. Anyway, it's not that important. He writes to his son. The last letter to his son is like 2 sentences. It's like 2 sentences. It's like, you should be here with me, and you can have the chain, the watch that you can have. That's it. And then he writes a letter to Maria Mantilla. It's very long, where it's like, I think of you when I look at the stars.
Sounds like Marti.
Just this beautiful letter, you know. And he writes to Carmen, the mother, and what he says to Carmen, it's like he's writing to his wife and the time about his daughter.
Yes.
It's really something to read that letter, and I have it somewhere, so I'll give it to you. Okay, so you know the rest. He arrives in Cuba on April 11th, May 2nd, the interview with the New York Herald, May 5th, the unfortunate encounter with Maceo, where he suspects he's being sidelined. There's a lot of myth and controversy about that period. May 18th, the last letter that he writes, that has that one quote, the quote that everybody quotes, the Sling of David quote. I find this one particularly interesting. I understand that a nation cannot be made to go against the spirit that moves it, or to do without that spirit. And I know how to set hearts on fire, and how to use the ardent and gratified state of those hearts for incessant agitation and attack. But where forms are concerned, there is room for many ideas, and the things of men are made by men. You know me. For myself, I will defend only that which I believe will guarantee or serve the revolution. I know how to disappear, but my ideas would not disappear, nor would my own obscurity embitter me. And I think this idea that he kind of knows. It's not guaranteed that he's going to be the president. It's not guaranteed that he's going to be able to stay in Cuba. It's not guaranteed that he's going to be able to stop the creation of a military dictatorship in Cuba afterwards. But he also knows how to keep his mouth shut. So he dies in Dos Rios, and his cadaver is taken to Santiago de Cuba. Talking about patterns in Cuban history, we all know the famous pictures of dead revolutionaries. The famous one, the Che Guevara picture, right, of Che Guevara's cadaver. The picture was taken of Marti's cadaver as well, after 3 days of it being buried. I don't show it here, but it can be found. You can see it, and it's interesting. I like it. I was going to show it, and I decided not to show it, if only because it embodies Marti again. And it's not just a Marti as an image. It's not just this Marti. It's a dead, buried, and decomposing Marti. It's a human Marti. And then there's a picture, and I still haven't figured out if it's legitimate or not. I've got to look into it closely. José Martí's son, Pepito, you can imagine, was brought up hearing nothing but shit about his father all the time. Here, why isn't he here? Your father doesn't support his family. I mean, he had to be hearing it all his life. He was, don't think Marti would have been particularly proud.
Oh, he
of-
definitely
He
wouldn't have
became a
been.
military man. He was involved in the suppression and massacre of the independent party of
He was
color
very involved.
in Cuba. There's even a picture of him
Mhm.
with the cadaver of one of the leaders, one of the Afro-Cuban leaders, standing by the dead body. But when they move Marti's body into the big mausoleum, whenever that happens, they exhume the body, and there's a crazy picture of Marti's skeleton, Marti's skull, as the box is open, you see Marti's skull, and Pepito's standing behind it, like with his hat in his hand, like taking off his hat as part of the picture. Really crazy picture.
Oh, you gotta find out more about that.
I got the picture, I'll show you.
Good time for.
So anyway, last thing, I know we're done. Last quote, postremerias, posthumousness, this is from one of his notebooks, posthumousness. I love this word in an extraordinary way. I love it as if it were a person. It made me a friend. This is this idea, no posthumousness. This idea that I don't know what it goes on, no, but it just means it's Marti that continues, to live in this way. So that's it. That's what I prepared. So let's take a break.